Nees. I am a senior research associate at the Environmental Finance. I just said senior research associate, didn't I? I'm the director of the Environmental Finance Center. I could do not. Where's Dave Goshern? Don't tell Joanne I just said that. For those of you who aren't familiar with our center, our immediate past director is now the deputy secretary of the Department of Natural Resources. And when she finds out I said that, she's going to wear me out. And so, anyway, we're very proud. Actually, little known fact, I hired Joanne. So technically, Governor Hogan and I made the same executive decision, when you think about it. And so I hired her way back. I left, as Dave said, to do the nonprofit thing. She hired me back in what we refer to as a bloodless coup. And then, like a game of ping pong, she left for DNR, and I became director again. So we're very proud of Joanne and where she is, and I'm very excited because basically it looks like this job is a launching point of very big things in the future for me. So I'd be very nice to me because you never know where I could end up. I could be very important. It could, or more likely Joanne's driver at some point. I'm going to talk, so this is us. We're located at the University of Maryland College Park. We're actually a regional center. We serve Region 3, EPA Region 3. There's an EFC in every region across the country, primarily university-based. There's one out west that's within a nonprofit. We are in Prinkert Fieldhouse, affectionately known as the second oldest building on campus. As you can see, not in a good way. If you come visit, don't settle in because a pipe could blow at any time. You never know. But we do a variety of things, but we are primarily locally based. We're very extension-like in our work, but we also do a lot of policy analysis, primarily at the state level, and that's where this particular project came from. So I'm going to talk to you about a report that we started in 2014 at the request of the Maryland legislature and the General Assembly. And basically what they asked from the state the Bay agencies was an accounting of what was happening with Bay restoration financing, and specifically what was being spent and what were we getting for what we were spending. And then they also wanted some kind of understanding of what it was going to take to achieve the 2025 WIP requirements. And that's where they asked EFC to engage. It was a relatively, it was an interesting process for a variety of reasons. It really was a lot of fun for us. We had great partners in DNR and MDE specifically, but also the other agencies. But there was an election in the middle of this project. So we started in, I think, August or September. And then there was an election. And I think like most people, given this was the state of Maryland, we assumed a Democrat was going to win the election. And it didn't turn out that way, obviously. And so I remember literally the night of the election, I went into the Hogan campaign website like, what are we in for? Because I didn't know. And it turns out it looked like we decided not to change anything in our report, that it was going to resonate. We felt like it would resonate, and it turns out it did, and we'll talk about what that means. So it was an interesting project. We delivered the report in January 2015. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the end, actually. And because we're trying to pick up some time, we did two things. We assessed where the state was in its financing, and then we made recommendations for how they were going to get to 2025 and beyond. And that's where I want to get to for today's conversation. So I'm going to go pretty rapidly through the assessment. If you have questions about our analysis and our data and how we came up with the numbers, I'm happy to answer those questions for you, but I think I'd prefer to answer those types of questions offline, so you're welcome to contact me however you like. But it's really the recommendations we want to go through. So the first summary finding was that in aggregate, Maryland will achieve its nutrient and sediment reduction goals. Why aren't all of you clapping, right? No, seriously. I mean, I know there are some major league howevers associated with that, and that's really was the point of the report. But that to me was stunning when we saw this. And we hadn't even started anything. It was just Lee Curry putting a graph in front of us. And we're like, all right, our work here is done, right? This is stunning. And it's important for us in the environmental community, and this is not a finance comment, it's more of a normative comment, to basically be articulating to the people in this watershed and those who are trying to impact that this is actually an achievable goal. And Maryland is an example that it's an achievable goal. Now, obviously, there are other states. We have Virginia, we have the headwaters, we have Pennsylvania. But this is an indication that we can get there. However, and that's what we're going to talk about today, is the howevers. We also have something that literally no other state in the United States has, which is significant revenue that is supporting non-point source pollution reductions. There is no other state in the country that has this type of revenue program. There are some states, Pennsylvania is one, that will have occasional push of money that will hit and get invested. But there are no states that have this sustained. I'm looking at my very refreshing looking cup of water on that table over there that I forgot to get. That's a facilitator. Thank you very much. That's right. Now we know why you're here, Dave. Thank you. That's right. So Maryland will invest $1 billion, thank you, Dave, between now and 2025 on non-point source reductions. And that's primarily from the Chesapeake and Atlantic Coastal Bays Trust Fund and the Bay Restoration Fund, which is known as the flush tax. Some assumptions about achieving our goal in that $1 billion, however, is that there's full compliance with existing regulations. We don't get to our goal if we don't have that. The state revenues are fully maintained. And by the way, the Hogan website said he would restore all environmental trust fund revenue. That's what his campaign site said. So we're going to assume he's going to do that. And that investments are made appropriately. So those are the howevers. And that's what we're going to talk about now. Nobody, by the way, and if you want to ask a question now, I'm fine with that. I think that's okay. Keep in mind we're trying to speed things up. But if you have a burning question or I say something that doesn't make a lot of sense, please ask the question. To me, what I'm assuming somebody's going to say, well, what do you mean by aggregate, right? Yes. And that's right. And we're going to get to that in a minute. And that's where there's a lot of controversy and why half of you probably didn't clap, because you don't think it's as cool as I think it is. So summary findings, continued success doesn't end in 2025. That's one of the big howevers of achieving the WIP. There has to be a renewed focus on efficiency and cost efficiency and effectiveness. And I don't like turning around and looking back, but I can't read the screen. And this one is a really big one. The states are being held responsible. It's the state's responsibility, each of the Bay states, to achieve the WIP. And what the state chooses to do with that responsibility determines who's going to pay. And that is a big issue when it comes to how the state is going to invest its money. And they really have two ways. There's only two things the states can do. They can pay for it themselves, or they can regulate it, and thereby assigning property rights to somebody else and therefore the financing obligation. That's it. There's no other out. We used to think that the other out was the federal government was going to step in and do it for us, right? So you remember the Blue Ribbon Finance panel and their request for $13 billion from the federal government? It's not going to happen. So these are the two options for the state. And it has a huge impact on how successful we're going to be and what it does. So this is the graph that shows what I was talking about. Now I'm going to have to take this off. So this is, and I think did Lee show this graph? Did we see this already? No? Something similar? All right. So this is basically keeping the trend where we're going. That's 2025. This is the actual full implementation of the WIP. And this, as we'll find out, this is essentially growth, the difference between the two. That was the next question I assume somebody would ask. That's why it doesn't end in 2025. We will get there in 2025, but if we don't do something, there'll be no economic growth in the state of Maryland after 2025, assuming we hold the states accountable to the Clean Water Act. So we're going to have to do something, and that's part of what we looked at about how we're going to make that happen. So then we looked at, and the report's available on our website if you want to see it. The state of Maryland also has it. We looked at each of the 4 sectors, sources of pollution, primary sources of pollution. And we wanted to know, based on those 2 options for the state, we wanted to figure out where we were. So what we wanted to know from each of them was how much of the pounds that had to be reduced were regulated. Does everybody get that? Not how much regulation, how many of the pounds that had to be reduced were regulated. The second thing was we wanted to look at how much was being spent. Again, this was our assessment was for the state. We were not making recommendations to the local, we were making recommendations to the state. We wanted to estimate a cost, and then we put recommendations for each sector. We made recommendations. And then we applied it to each of the 4 areas. So we started with agriculture. We looked at the primary regulatory tools. There aren't a lot. Most of you probably know agriculture is the only industry that is explicitly exempt from regulation in the Clean Water Act. So it creates a lot of problems for the federal government. States can do many other things. The regulatory gap then was 98% for nitrogen. That's a bad thing, right? So that means well, it depends on who you are. If there's any farmers in here, they're probably not thinking it's as bad. But that means only 2% of the nitrogen that has to be reduced is regulated, and only 22% of the phosphorus is regulated. So what does that mean for the state? They got to pay for it, or they got to regulate it. That's it. There's no other choice. Or somehow the market kicks in, like all of a sudden nitrogen becomes really, really valuable. It could. It could. You know what actually is more likely to become really, really valuable? Phosphorus, right? Because it's a limiting element on our planet, and we are running out of it rapidly. And so phosphorus has a chance to become very valuable, and that's the reason why a lot of people are speculating going forward on manure. So the financing mechanisms, regulated pounds are primarily CAFOs. That's really where most of them are, but we really don't get a lot of load, nutrient load, coming out of CAFOs. And so it's really the private sector and cost share subsidies. And by the way, I'll get to that later. In unregulated pounds, again, it's going to be cost share and subsidies, and then some private investment, but it's really going to be, most of that is cost shares and subsidies. Some of that cost share is federal, obviously. A lot of that cost share is federal, but the rest of it will be state. So the financing gap for agriculture was almost $200 million. So you might be asking yourself, well, I should step back. Agriculture is one of the great success stories of the restoration effort. And now everybody's like, oh, give me a break, right? It's true. When you look at the graph, ag loads are coming down, 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 down. And we're going to talk about some other sectors where that's not happening. So ag is actually going down at a rate that we need it to go down. But the thing is, we have a gap. And if this gap doesn't get filled, that trend is going to stop, is basically what it's saying. There's also the possibility that the cost estimates are off. You can go into the report and judge for yourself on the cost estimates. We did basically our estimates were based on a literature review, and we took 4 different sources and then identified the ones that we thought made the most sense, and there were some outliers. So the gap was $190 million. Recommendations, enforce existing regs. There weren't a lot of them, though CAFOs need to be enforced much more than they are right now. That was clear. And then focus existing investments on efficiency. And we'll talk about what that means. That is not how we focus cost share money right now, primarily. Next, we looked at stormwater. So remember the good news of ag? Well, now there's the bad news of stormwater. It's the only sector that's going up. The loads are going up. So why is it going up? Economic growth, right? And population growth. And what that means is, by definition, that means that the existing laws for new growth, new stormwater management, aren't strong enough if we're going to achieve 2025 and maintain 2025. It's just by definition that's the case. Because if the only way that would not be the case is if stormwater were flat. That's the only way that would not be the case. So it doesn't, I mean, we can pick up the pound somewhere else if you want to. However, within just stormwater itself, it is by far cheaper to stop the pollution than it is to clean it up once it's there. By far, order of magnitude cheaper. So at some point we're going to have to think about, does the 2007 stormwater law, or whatever it's called, need to be strengthened? And I think the answer is going to be yes. So you have a regulatory structure, you have new emissions that are managed through the permitting process, Stormwater Management Act, as well as the NPDES construction permitting process. That's a national program. Every state has to comply with that. And then existing pollution is the MS permitting program. The regulatory gap is 44 to 75%. So about half of the load that is needed to be reduced from stormwater to achieve the WIP is unregulated. And this is coming from the state of Maryland. And now think about the phase 1 MS4 permits. They're very restrictive, and I can tell you they're some of the most restrictive in the country. Virginia's coming up right behind it, the way that they do it. But this is a sobering number, because even with that real stringent regulatory process, it's only about half the load, which means we're going to have to pick it up some other way. So then we looked at the numbers. What did all of this mean? The total WIP cost was $7.4 billion. The MS4 costs were $3.4 billion. State revenue flows going into stormwater were $560 million projected to 2025. Local, and by the way, our number, the way we did that was looking at the trends in the state of Maryland, how much they were spending on ag and how much they were spending on stormwater, and that's where we got that number. Local MS4 financing was $2.6 billion. So we have a gap to achieve the stormwater WIP of over $4 billion, and we have a gap to achieve MS4 financing of over $700 million. This is the number that concerns me the most, because that's basically saying, yeah, we know we have to do it, and we know we're not collecting enough money to do it, and at some point we're going to have to catch up, and it's going to be really expensive to do that. But this is the number, right, that really jumps out. $4 billion plus gap to achieve the stormwater WIP. So now that I've been a total buzzkill, basically enforce the law is what we're saying, and target investments to the unregulated emissions. And nobody has said anything about that yet, but you will. Septic. Septic's really expensive. None of it is regulated. Now that's not, I'm not saying that we don't have septic regulations. We do, we have lots of them, but they're not for nitrogen. They're for human health, as they, we should be. But we don't regulate nitrogen of existing, and that's why you see this highlighted. Existing load, it is not regulated. New loads, regulated, especially in the critical area. We have a $3.4 billion gap within septic. Number one, we said, don't subsidize failing septic tanks, right? Expand BAT requirement to the entire state and allow attrition to solve the problem. So basically what we're saying with septics is do nothing. Make it illegal to install a standard septic tank and then just walk away. And let attrition solve the problem. Now I understand there are some places where you don't want to do that, Solomon Island, Anne Arundel County, where they have more than 50,000 tanks. But for the most part, statewide, let attrition solve the problem. A septic tank lasts about 25 years. When it has to be replaced, make them put in either BAT or they tie that community into an ENR plant and then walk away. That won't get all of the pounds that are in the WIP for septics, but you pick those other pounds up somewhere else. It's a lot cheaper, and I got to hurry up or we're not going to have time. Then now with all that buzzkill, now we get the good news, and it's wastewater treatment. There is no gap. We have solved the problem, except for future growth. We'll talk about that in a minute. There is no gap. It's done. Flush tax, yay, it worked. As a market guy, it wasn't the way I would have done it, but that's why I'm just a director and not the Deputy Secretary, Department of Natural Resources. So here it is in aggregate. This is the regulatory gap, 7 million pounds is our gap. Then we're talking about nitrogen here. We have numbers, the same ones for phosphorus, but I just picked up nitrogen here. And this is what it means in dollars. If you go sector by sector, we have a gap of $7.7 billion to achieve the WIP, sector by sector, right? Not aggregate. We've got to do it in each one of them. And we know where most of that is coming from, right? You can see it right there. It's coming from two places, on-site and urban, and as you all know, those are the two places that are the smallest load going into the bay. Oh, I'm sorry, the number that's not up there that you can't see, and I apologize for not getting this slide up there. The number, the gap, if we do it the other way around, aggregate everything in, is less than, it's just over $1 billion. So it's a huge drop in the amount of money that we're going to need. So our recommendations, this is what we want to get to. So did everybody get what nobody is questioning these rather profound assumptions that we're making. So by adding everything up and saying that's the direction we're going to go, what does that mean for stormwater? It means just comply with your permit, primarily. It means with septic, don't let them put in a standard tank. And most of the money, if not all of it, you're going to invest is going to go to agriculture, quite honestly, because that's where you're going to get the efficiency. So target state investments. So this is the second thing. In order for this to work, you have to target state investments to unregulated emissions. No more subsidizing regulated emissions. No more grants to urban communities to install stormwater practices. Those grants should go to the Environmental Finance Center for doing these types of studies. I thought that was funnier than you did. No, you can't. If we fund regulated emissions, we're dead. We'll never get there. And you stood up, Dave, and I think that means I got to hurry up. 2 minutes. Strive for efficiency. Well, this is the one. Where'd it go? Yeah, all right, so basically what we said, and I'm going to jump to the end of the story, we basically said the state needs a credit-based financing system. The state needs to stop doing RFPs for grants and need to start buying pounds in the form of credits. They need to register those credits in the state water quality trading registry system, and they need to track them for performance. And that is the only way it's going to happen. And the reason for that, the need for that, is we have to build capacity back in the system. So when I said don't subsidize regulated pounds, if we do that, all of that achieving the goal by 2025, the way things are going, is at the expense of all the growth that was permitted into the wastewater treatment plants. So if there are any wastewater treatment plant operators here, they got to be like, what are you talking about? But that's what's happening. And the only way we're going to succeed beyond 2025 is if we somehow build those pounds back into the system. And what we're suggesting is it needs to be a credit-based financing system that will get us there. I recognize this is controversial. This idea was even tried to put through the legislature, and just about everybody came out against it. I said just about because the Environmental Finance Center did not come out against it. But it's the only way that having a market-based system and a performance-based system is the only way we will get to where we need to go. And the state must focus its money on efficiency, the most efficient and effective pound. It can't think about political issues. It can't think about sectoral issues. It has to go for the pound that matters the most. Easy for me to say. I don't have the lobbyists coming at me, telling me that money was destined for us. But that's, in our assessment, what needs to happen. We put in a lot more recommendations than that. Please read the report. Again, I'm very happy to answer any questions offline, happy to debate it offline. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it. Did I make it?
You made your time, and I
okay.
do want to leave. Yeah. So stay up. I want to leave time for one or two questions. Yes, sir.
The question I have has a little math issue. You started off at the outset saying follow the regulations. Then you said fully funded, and then you did not add the inflation. So if you're fully funding at 200,000 and inflation is up 2%, you just went down 1.5. So how do you make the math work?
Through a spreadsheet that's in the report. I just didn't have time to talk about all of that. We use a discount rate of 5%, which is very, very conservative. And by the way, when EFC does these types of calculations, over the last 10 years, with interest rates being historically low, we always kind of fall back to a 5% rate because we know it's higher than it will actually be. And so the costs are much more conservative than, or the estimate's much more conservative otherwise be. So excellent question, and it's in there. So.
Here. According to the state law, local governments have to make a major contribution towards non-point source regulation from existing developments. About half the counties have stepped up and provided a reasonable amount of funds to do so, which I'm not sure what your figure totally recommends. But if the other 4 or 5 counties who are required of the 10, that would be a considerable additional source of funding to meet the non-point source requirements, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And, you know, again, I don't mean to make this too simplistic, but enforce the law, and that money will avail itself. So that's the solution. So yes, that was the reason for the gap, and that's how you would close that regulated gap. You would enforce the Clean Water Act. Great. All right. Thank you again. I appreciate it. Yep.
Thank you very much, Dan.